Ethan's boots thudded heavily against the ground as he pushed through the thick underbrush of the alien planet. The air was humid and filled with the sharp scent of strange flowers. He'd been here for hours, scanning the area for signs of life, just as his mission instructed him. This planet wasn't known for its peaceful creatures, and he was on alert. Always keeping his eyes on the trees and the shadowy paths between them, he checked his handheld device. Signal was weak, but it was still there, a faint distress. Signal, one he had picked up while on patrol. His instructions were clear. Check it out and report back. Ethan had learned not to ignore these things. He'd seen enough in his time in the service to know that when an SOS went unanswered, it usually meant someone was in serious trouble. As he moved deeper into the forest, the noise of the wildlife grew louder. Ethan's hand rested on the blaster, at his side, just in case. He knew how dangerous this place could be. The trees towered high above him, casting thick shadows on the ground. The closer he got to the source of the distress signal, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, there was a sound, a sharp, desperate cry. Help. The voice was high-pitched and unmistakable, and it rang out clearly in the stillness of the forest. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He took off at a sprint, weaving through the thick foliage, his eyes scanning the area. It didn't take long before he found her. Trapped in a series of sharp metal spikes, a young alien woman struggled against the trap. Her hands were bound by thick ropes, and she was fighting to free herself. But the more she moved, the deeper the spikes embedded themselves in the ground. The trap had been designed to capture, not kill, but it looked painful and dangerous nonetheless. Without hesitation, Ethan pulled out his blade and sliced through the ropes. The woman froze, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto his. "Stay still," Ethan commanded, trying to keep his voice calm. He knew the trap was dangerous, and one wrong move could make it worse. The woman's alien features were striking her. Skin was a soft shade of lavender, and her eyes, large and bright, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling but sharp. Like she was prepared for a fight, Ethan quickly scanned the trap, looking for a way to disarm it. "I'm here to help. You're lucky I found you." She narrowed her eyes, still suspicious. "Help, or are you one of them?" "Them?" Ethan asked, confused for a moment. He turned back to the trap. It was a classic hunting snare used by some of the more hostile species on this planet. The last thing he needed was to fight off a whole hunting party while trying to save this woman. They hunt us, the ones who catch us. They kill us. But you're human, aren't you? Her voice had a new edge to it. The suspicion was still there, but something else seemed to shine through. "Two," Ethan nodded, his eyes still focused on the trap. "I'm human, and I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just trying to get you out of here." She didn't answer him right away, but she didn't resist when he cut the last rope that was holding her to the trap. With a quick motion, Ethan yanked the last spike away from her leg. The woman flinched, but she was free now. Ethan helped her up carefully.
Ow.
She winced as she stood, clearly not used to being in such a vulnerable position. "Thank you," said her voice soft, though still wary. "But you should leave. This is not your fight." "I'm not leaving without you," Ethan said firmly. "I didn't come all this way just to leave someone in danger." She looked at him, clearly surprised by his words. "You came all this way for me?" Ethan shrugged, a little uncomfortable with the attention. "Like I said, I'm not leaving." "You hear?" The alien woman seemed to hesitate, then nodded slowly, her eyes studying him with an intensity that made him feel like she was searching for something more in him. "I'm Lyra," she finally said, after a long pause. "And I'm not here by choice. You should turn back. The hunters will come for us soon." Ethan frowned. "Hunters?" Lyra's face hardened. "Yes. The predators on this planet, they hunt my people. I'm a resistance fighter, and they want me dead. I was on a mission to sabotage their weapons, but they caught me. They'll come for me now, and they'll take you too if you're not careful." Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had known about the dangerous creatures on this planet, but he hadn't known that the hunters were organized and so focused on capturing and killing other sentient beings. What are we going to do now? Ethan asked, realizing that staying in one place was not an option anymore. Lyra gave him a long look, and her eyes softened just a little. We need to get to my base. The resistance is waiting for me, but it won't be easy. The hunters won't give up so easily. They'll track us every step of the way. Ethan glanced back at the way he had come. He wasn't sure what had drawn him here, whether it was his training, his curiosity, or just pure luck. But now that he had found her, he wasn't going to leave her to face this alone. Then let's get moving, Ethan said, his voice steady. Together, they moved through the thick forest, Lyra limping slightly but determined to keep pace. Ethan kept his eyes on the trees and the shadows, waiting for any sign of danger. He didn't know how he had ended up here or what would happen next, but he was certain of one thing: this wouldn't be the last time he would have to protect Lyra. The dense forest seemed endless, with towering trees and thick underbrush blocking their way. Ethan kept his pace steady, moving cautiously, with his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. He could feel the weight of the alien's presence. Beside him, her soft footsteps barely making a sound against the dirt. Lyra had become quieter since they began walking, but Ethan could tell she was still alert, every nerve on edge. Are we far from the base? Ethan asked, trying to break the tense silence. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Her eyes darted to the thick shadows around them. Not far, ... but we have to be careful. The hunters know the land better than anyone. They can track us without making a sound. Ethan glanced at her, noticing the anxiety in her eyes despite her calm voice. So what are we supposed to do if they catch up? Lyra hesitated before answering. We run. We fight if we have to. But running is the best option. We need to stay ahead of them. Ethan gave a slow nod, gripping his blaster tighter. 8 had been trained for situations like this, but there was something different about this mission. He wasn't just protecting a random person. He was protecting someone who had been fighting for her life, someone who knew what it meant to survive. They continued to move deeper into the forest, and the silence around them felt suffocating. The usual sounds of the alien wildlife had died down, as if the creatures themselves knew something was coming, after what felt like hours. Lyra stopped abruptly, her body stiffening. Ethan looked up at her, feeling the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Something's wrong, she whispered, her voice low. Ethan's hand instinctively went to his weapon, and he surveyed the area. He didn't see anything, but he could feel it. The air had changed, and the quiet was almost too quiet. Before he could speak, sound of branches snapping filled the air, followed by the unmistakable hiss of something large moving through the trees. Lyra grabbed his arm, her grip strong. Despite her earlier injury, they're here, she muttered, urgency in her voice. We need to go now. Without waiting for Ethan's reply, Lyra took off at a sprint, her feet barely touching the ground as she moved with an agility that surprised him. He quickly followed, pushing through the underbrush, his eyes scanning every shadow. They were fast, but the hunters were faster as they ran. Ethan could hear the faint rustling behind them, the sound of heavy footsteps, the snap of branches being crushed underfoot. They were closing in. Don't stop. Lyra's voice rang out ahead of him. They'll catch us if we do. Ethan's heart raced in his chest as his legs burned with each step. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but this felt different. The fear in Lyra's eyes, the desperation in her voice, it was real. They weren't just running from a group of hunters. They were running for their lives. Suddenly, there was a flash of movement in the corner of his vision. Ethan spun around, raising his blaster just in time to see a dark figure dart through the trees. It was one of the hunters, cloaked in dark armor. Moving quickly and silently, Ethan fired, the blast ringing out through the trees. Figure dodged, vanishing into the thick foliage. Keep running, Lyra called back to him. Don't stop. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He picked up the pace, pushing his body harder, every step harder than the last. His legs felt like lead, and sweat dripped down his forehead, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. As they moved through the trees, another shape appeared larger. This time, its eyes glowing faintly. Ethan's pulse quickened as the figure stepped into their path. The hunter was tall, at least 7 feet, its body covered in dark, reflective armor, its eyes yellow and unblinking, fixed on Ethan and Lyra with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. Lyra swore under her breath, "It's a tracker. They've set it on us." The creature let out a low, growling hiss, and then it lunged. Lyra reacted first, pulling out a small, sharp dagger from her side and slashing at the air, just missing the creature as it tried to swipe at them. "Move." Lyra shouted as she dodged another attack. Ethan aimed his blaster, firing several shots at the creature. One hit its shoulder, and the creature let out a low hiss of pain, but didn't back down. "Get behind me," Ethan shouted, pushing Lyra to the side. He needed to protect her at all costs. The creature snarled, its massive arms swinging at Ethan with surprising speed. Ethan ducked, barely avoiding the strike, but the creature's claws grazed his arm, leaving a burn mark. Gritted his teeth against the pain and fired again, this time hitting the creature square in the chest. The beast staggered, but it didn't fall. Lyra, seeing Ethan distracted, moved quickly to his side. She pulled a small explosive device from her belt and tossed it at the creature's feet. There was a loud bang, and the creature was thrown back. Crashing into a tree with a sickening thud, Ethan took a deep breath, his chest heaving from the adrenaline. He turned to Lyra, his eyes wide with disbelief. "That was impressive." Lyra gave him a sharp look, though there was a hint of a smile in her eyes. "We don't have time for compliments. Let's go." Ethan nodded, his heart still racing. And together, they continued their escape. They pushed through the forest, dodging fallen trees and thick vines. Behind them, the sounds of the hunters grew fainter, but Ethan didn't trust it. They hadn't seen the last of them. After what felt like another hour of running, they stumbled into a clearing. Lyra stopped suddenly, her breathing heavy, and she looked around, scanning the area for any sign of danger. "We need to move quickly," she said, her voice quiet. "They'll regroup." "We can't afford to wait any longer." Ethan glanced at her, still processing what had just happened. He had known they were in danger, but seeing that Hunter in action was a different story. These creatures weren't just predators. They were organized, deadly, and relentless. "We'll keep moving," Ethan said, tightening his grip on his blaster. "I'll protect you." Lyra gave him a grateful look, and for a moment he saw a flicker of trust in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. With the weight of the hunters on their heels, they ran again, disappearing into the shadows of the alien forest, determined to survive whatever came next. The forest was dense, its towering trees blocking out much of the light. The thick air was hard to breathe, heavy with the scent of unknown plants and the occasional sharp odor of wet earth. Ethan could hear Lyra's breath behind him, steady, but quiet, as if she too was listening for any movement in the shadows. "Are we far from the base?" he asked again, though he already knew the answer. Lyra's voice came softly, but it was filled with determination. "Not far. We're close enough, but they're closing in." Ethan glanced over at her. She was limping slightly, her movements quick but cautious. Her earlier strength had begun to show cracks. She had been through a lot, but the recent attack had taken its toll. He wanted to offer some words of comfort, but he didn't know what to say. What could he say? It was out of his depth. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a scout who had stumbled into a deadly situation. But now, in the face of danger, there was something more. Something that kept him moving forward. "I'll make sure you get there," Ethan said, his voice steady, though inside he was worried. Lyra nodded but didn't speak. They moved in silence for several minutes, but the tension in the air was growing. The rustling of leaves behind them was faint but constant, and Ethan knew the hunters were still tracking them. "Keep moving," Lyra said suddenly, her voice sharp. She grabbed his arm and pointed ahead. "There's a clearing up ahead. We need to hide." Ethan didn't question her, pushed forward, ducking low to the ground. They reached the clearing just as the sound of the hunters grew louder. Air felt colder in the open space, and the scent of the forest was thicker here. Lyra pulled him down behind a thick bush, and they crouched low, both holding their breath. Ethan's mind raced. The hunters weren't far behind. He could feel it, a weight in the air. They were closing in. Lyra glanced at him, her face tense. "They're using their trackers." We need to make ourselves less visible. Ethan nodded, silently thanking whatever gods existed for Lyra's experience. He had no idea how to deal with hunters like these. He was just a man in the wrong place. At the wrong time, but she knew what she was doing. She reached into a small pouch at her side and pulled out a set of tiny, glowing beads. Camouflage, she explained quietly. It will hide us from their view for a short time, but it won't last long. She handed him a bead, and he held it in his palm. It was warm to the touch, but it gave off a faint glow, a soft light that reminded him of the stars in the night sky. He rolled the bead between his fingers, waiting for her to show him what to do. Lyra took a deep breath and then began to crush the bead in her hand. As soon as she did, a soft wave of light spread out from her fingers, casting a faint, shimmering glow over her and Ethan. It was subtle but effective, and for a moment, Ethan felt his heart slow. The glow seemed to blend them into the surrounding foliage, as though they were just another part of the forest. The sound of the hunter's footsteps grew closer, and Ethan's heartbeat picked up once more. They were almost there. Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. We wait. Ethan nodded, staying as still as possible. His hand was still on his blaster, but he knew better than to make any sudden moves. The hunters were patient. They would wait. For a mistake, a sign of weakness. That's how they worked. Could hear them now, walking right past their hiding place, not even pausing to look. Minutes passed, and the forest around them seemed to hold its breath. The hunters moved on, unaware of their presence. Ethan let out a quiet exhale, his body finally relaxing. Lyra's grip on his arm loosened, but she didn't move right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the area where the hunters had passed. Is it over? Ethan asked in a low voice. For now, Lyra replied, but they will return. They always do. Ethan looked at her. Are you sure we can make it? To your base? Lyra's eyes softened for a brief moment, and for the first time, Ethan saw something like hope in them. We have to. I can't. Stop now. My people need me. Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He had no idea how much more of this he could take, but he couldn't abandon her now. Wasn't sure what it was, but there was something inside him now, a sense of duty, something deeper than just protecting her. He didn't want to leave her alone. Then let's go, he said, standing up slowly. They moved again, careful and quiet. This time, though, there was less fear in the air. They were learning to move together, to trust each other. Pace had slowed, but Ethan stayed by her side, ready to support her when she needed it. As they continued through the thick trees, the landscape began to change. The terrain grew rockier, with steep cliffs and narrow paths. Lyra led the way, her movements more confident now, despite her injuries. She moved with a purpose, her focus unwavering. Ethan stayed close, watching her every move. There was something about her that had changed since they first met. She had always been strong, but now she was almost ... different. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a leader, a warrior. As they approached a narrow ridge, Lyra stopped suddenly, her eyes narrowing. She held up a hand, signaling for Ethan to stop. What is it? He whispered, his hand on his weapon. There's a lookout ahead, Lyra explained quietly. We need to get around it without being seen. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. They couldn't afford to be spotted. If they were, the hunters would have them cornered in minutes. Lyra crouched low, moving to the side of the path. Ethan followed her, his eyes scanning the ridgeline for any signs of movement. It was getting harder to see in the growing darkness. But he knew they couldn't afford to stop now. They moved carefully along the edge, keeping as low as possible. The ridge was steep, and the rocks underfoot were slippery, but they didn't make a sound. It felt like hours before they finally reached a narrow gap between two large rocks, a hidden passage that led deeper into the forest. Once they were safely hidden, Lyra turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with exhaustion. We're close now, she said, a small but relieved smile tugging at her lips. Ethan smiled back, his heart lighter than it had been all day. Good, let's finish this together. They continued forward, knowing that the danger was far from over, but determined. to face whatever came next together. The sun had set, and the sky was painted with hues of purple and dark blue, casting the alien landscape in a soft glow. The dense forest, with its towering trees and thick vines, felt strangely peaceful now that the hunters were no longer directly on their tail. But Ethan knew better than to relax too much. The threat was still very much alive. Lingering in the shadows of the night, they had stopped for a short rest in a secluded area of the forest. Lyra leaned against a large rock, her eyes scanning the surroundings, while Ethan set up a small camp. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so tense. His hand was always on the blaster now, his senses sharp. But despite the constant danger, he felt a strange connection growing between him and Lyra. She hadn't spoken much since their close call with the hunters. But he could see the toll the day had taken on her. Eyes, though strong, looked tired, and her movements were slower than before. She had been through so much, and yet she didn't seem to complain. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, sitting down beside her. Lyra glanced at him, surprised by the question. She gave a small nod, but her expression remained serious. "I'll be fine. I've been through worse." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Worse than almost being killed by hunters? I find that hard to believe." Lyra smiled slightly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You'd be surprised. There's a lot you don't know about my people." Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. He had noticed she hadn't shared much about herself, aside from the fact that she was part of a resistance. But even that had been vague, and he had been too focused on survival to press for more details. Now, as they sat in the quiet of the night, it seemed like the right time to ask, "What do you mean?" He asked softly, "What happened to your people?" Lyra's eyes shifted to the ground, her face shadowed in the dim light. "My people, ... We were once a proud civilization. We lived peacefully until the hunters arrived. They weren't always here. We didn't even know they existed until they started attacking us. At first, it was just a few of them. Now they come in droves." Ethan's heart sank as he listened. He had heard of violent species in the galaxy, but nothing had prepared him for the cruelty Lyra described. "So, you're part of the resistance?" he asked, wanting to understand more. "But you're not just fighting for survival, are you?" Lyra's gaze met his, and this time, there was a hint of something. More something that made Ethan's chest tighten. "No," she said quietly. "We're fighting for our future, our children, ... our families. The hunters don't just kill us, they capture us, force us to fight in their arenas, use us for sport. My people are hunted for their blood, for their strength. We've been slaves." In our own home, Ethan was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of her words. He had never imagined that something like this could happen, people being treated as prey, as nothing more than trophies to be won. "Is that why you were on that mission?" he asked. "To sabotage their operations?" Lyra nodded. "Yes. I was part of a team sent to destroy one of their supply bases. We were close to finishing it when they found us. The mission failed. They caught me. But they won't stop. They can't." Her voice grew harder, fiercer. "The resistance isn't just about survival anymore. It's about taking back our world. We're not going to hide forever." Ethan looked at her, his admiration for her growing. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a leader, fighting for everything her people had lost. "I had no idea," he said softly. I thought we were just running from danger." Lyra's expression softened, and she gave a slight smile. "You think I'm just some helpless woman to be saved? I've been fighting for my life since I was a child. I'm not just running from the hunters, Ethan. I'm trying to make sure they don't get away with what they've done to us." Ethan felt a knot in his stomach. He had known she was strong, but now he realized just how much strength it took for her to keep going day after day. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the survival of her people. And she had taken him along for the journey, trusting him. Even though he was an outsider, "I'm not helpless," Lyra continued, her voice soft but firm. "I know you've been protecting me, but I'm not helpless. I've fought in the arenas. I've faced worse than this." Ethan nodded, but there was something in his chest that tightened at her words. He had been protecting her. Yes. But now he realized it wasn't just about keeping her safe. It was about something more, something deeper. I didn't mean to imply that you were, he said quietly. But I'm glad you trust me. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that felt like a shared understanding. I do, she said softly. And I know you're not just here by accident. There's something about you, Ethan. You're not like the others I've met. You're not just a soldier following orders. You think for yourself. You protect those who need it, even when it's not your fight. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to say anything like that. I'm just doing what feels right, he said with a shrug. I wasn't supposed to be here. But now that I'm with you, I don't think I can just walk away. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the crackling of the small fire between them the only sound. Ethan didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave her. He couldn't turn his back on the fight she was leading. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting for a future where she and her people could live in peace. Lyra stood up, her eyes scanning the dark forest once more. We need to keep moving. The hunters will be looking for us by dawn. Look. Ethan nodded, standing. Beside her, there was no more time for rest. The journey wasn't over yet. But for the first time since he'd met Lyra, he wasn't worried about surviving. He was worried about something else, something he couldn't name. But it was there, growing stronger with each step they took together. Lyra gave him a quick, steady look before turning back to the path ahead. Come on, she said. We have a world to take back. Ethan smiled, his resolve stronger than ever. Let's do it. Together, they stepped into the shadows of the forest, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. There was no turning back now. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light cutting through the trees and casting long shadows on the ground. The forest was quieter than it had been before, as if even the animals knew something important was about to happen. Ethan and Lyra had been traveling for hours. And though they were closer to their destination, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them. Lyra led the way, moving with the same quiet confidence she always had, but Ethan noticed the tension in her shoulders. He could see the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The resistance base wasn't far now, but they knew that the hunters wouldn't stop until they were caught. Lyra had been right, they would never stop. We're close, Lyra murmured, pausing for a moment to glance back at him. We should be there by morning. Ethan nodded, his hand on his blaster. He had learned to trust her instincts, but he couldn't ignore the sense of danger that seemed to follow them wherever they went. The hunters had a way of making everything feel like a trap. The silence of the forest was almost suffocating as they continued on. Suddenly a noise broke. Through the stillness, a soft rustling followed by the unmistakable snap of a twig. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The hunters were here. Get down, Lyra hissed, dropping to the ground in an instant. Ethan didn't hesitate. He crouched low, staying as close to the trees as possible, his eyes scanning the area. He could hear movement all around them now, faint but unmistakable. The hunters were closing in, surrounding them from all sides. They found us, Lyra whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and fear. You're not letting us go this time. Ethan's pulse quickened. He couldn't run anymore. They were too close to the base. It was time to fight. Do you have a plan? Ethan asked, his voice low. Lyra's eyes narrowed, her jaw set with determination. We fight. We take down as many of them as we can. Ethan looked around, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't take on the hunter's head and not without reinforcements. He scanned the forest once more, looking for anything they could use. That's when he saw it, a large tree, its branches hanging low. It's almost like a natural bridge. We can use that tree, he said, pointing toward it. If we climb it, we can get above them. Lyra glanced up, considering the idea. It's risky, she said, her voice tense. But it might be our only chance. They moved quickly, using the cover of the trees to hide their movements. The hunters hadn't seen them yet, but Ethan could hear them getting closer, their heavy footsteps crunching in the underbrush. They climbed the tree with practiced skill, Lyra leading the way. Ethan followed close behind, his breath coming faster now. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the adrenaline surging through him. As they reached the top of the tree, Ethan looked down. The hunters were close now, their figures dark and menacing in the moonlight. They were armed, their weapons glowing faintly as they moved through the forest. Ethan held his breath, watching them closely. Lyra crouched beside him, her eyes scanning the area. "I can't wait much longer," she said quietly. "They'll spot us if we stay here too long." Ethan nodded. "We have to move."
Out.
Warning. Lyra jumped down, landing lightly on the ground below. Ethan followed her, dropping silently into the shadows. They were in position now. The hunters were within range. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment, the tension building. In the air, Lyra didn't hesitate. She sprinted forward, her movements swift and fluid. The hunters were too focused on their search to notice her until it was too late. She launched herself into the first hunter, knocking him to the ground. Ethan wasn't far behind. He fired. A shot, taking down another hunter with precision. The battle was on. The hunters fought back fiercely, but Lyra and Ethan were faster. They moved like shadows, striking from unexpected angles, using the trees and rocks around them for cover. The hunters were powerful, but they were also overconfident. They had underestimated Lyra and Ethan. Lyra was a blur of motion, her sharp blade flashing as she took down one hunter after another. Ethan fired his blaster, hitting his targets with deadly accuracy. Every shot counted. Every movement was critical. They couldn't afford to miss. But as the last hunter fell, a voice shouted from the shadows, "Stop! You can't defeat us." Lyra froze, her eyes darting to the source of the voice. Ethan's heart sank as a tall figure emerged from the darkness. The leader of the hunters, his armor was black and gleamed in the moonlight, and his eyes glowed a dangerous yellow. "You fought well," the hunter leader said, his voice cold. "But you cannot win. This planet belongs to us." Ethan's grip tightened on his blaster, but Lyra stepped forward, her gaze steady. "Not anymore," she said, her voice full of defiance. "We're taking back our world." The hunter leader laughed, a low mocking sound. "You think you can defeat us? We are the apex predators. You are nothing." Ethan felt his blood run cold. The hunter leader wasn't just a skilled fighter, he was a monster. A creature who reveled in the pain and suffering of others. But Lyra wasn't backing down. She stood tall, her eyes fixed on the hunter leader with unwavering determination. "We are not nothing," she said, her voice fierce. "We are the future of this planet." Without warning, Lyra lunged at the hunter leader, her blade flashing in the moonlight. The hunter leader raised his weapon, blocking her strike with ease. The two of them were locked in a deadly dance, each one trying to gain the upper hand. Ethan watched for a moment, then acted, fired, hitting the hunter leader in the shoulder. The shot didn't kill him, but it was enough to make him stumble. Lyra took advantage of the opening. She struck again, this time landing a blow that sent the hunter leader crashing to the ground. The fight was over. The leader was down, defeated. Lyra stood over him, breathing heavily, her eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and relief. "Done," she said quietly. Ethan nodded, his chest heaving. They had done it. They had won. But even as the hunter leader lay on the ground, Ethan knew this wasn't the end. The war was far from over. There were more hunters out there and more battles to be fought. But for the first time, Ethan believed they had a chance. Lyra looked at him, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "We're in this together." They stood there, side by side, looking out over the forest. The battle had been won, but the fight for their future was just beginning. The battle was over, and the silence that followed felt surreal. The sounds of the forest had returned, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of unknown creatures. But for Ethan and Lyra, the quiet was more than just the absence of noise. It was a moment of peace after the chaos, a moment that felt like a breath of air after being submerged in water for too long. Lyra stood still, her breath heavy and steady as she looked down at the fallen hunters. The leader, the one who had caused so much suffering, was lying unconscious but alive, his eyes fluttering as if trying to stay awake. Ethan stood beside her, watching the scene unfold. "It's done," Lyra said, her voice soft but strong. "They're not going to hunt my people anymore." Ethan could feel the weight of her words. He had seen the fear and pain in her eyes when they first met, but now there was something different, something hopeful. She had just taken down the leader of the hunters, but more than that, she had done what many thought was impossible. She had fought back and won. He placed a hand on her shoulder, offering the comfort of his presence. "You've changed everything, Lyra." She turned to him, her expression still serious but with a flicker of gratitude. "No, we've changed it. You were with me every step of the way. You didn't have to help me, but you did." Ethan gave her a small smile. "I couldn't just leave you to fight alone." They stood there for a moment, sharing a quiet understanding. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something greater. They had fought not just for their lives, but for a future Lyra's people's future. And now, standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by the remnants of the battle, they had earned that future. Lyra's eyes softened as she looked around the clearing. "We have to move quickly. There's still a few hunters out there, and they'll want revenge." Ethan nodded. He knew they couldn't stay here long. The fight had drawn attention, and soon enough, the remaining hunters would regroup and come after them. But he also knew something else. They had time. The leader had been defeated. The resistance now had a chance to rise. Lyra took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "Let's get to the base. The others need to know what happened here." Ethan and Lyra made their way through the forest, keeping to the shadows, moving swiftly but cautiously. As they walked, the weight of the situation started to settle in for Ethan. He had been thrown into this conflict without warning, but now it was clear to him that his place was here by Lyra's side, fighting for what was right. As they approached the resistance base, a feeling of anticipation filled the air. They were so close now, yet Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was just the beginning. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. They had taken down the hunter's leader, but there were still many battles to fight, and many challenges ahead. The base was hidden deep in the heart of the forest, a place that Lyra's people had used as a refuge for years. As they neared the entrance, a small group of resistance fighters stepped out to meet them. They had heard the news of the battle and the defeat of the hunter leader, and their faces lit up with hope as they saw Lyra and Ethan. "You did it," one of the fighters said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You actually did it." Lyra gave a tired smile, her eyes scanning the group. "We did it together, but it's not over. We need to keep moving forward. The hunters won't stop, not yet." The fighters nodded, their expressions resolute. They had seen what Lyra was capable of, and they knew that under her leadership, they had a chance. Ethan stood at her side, silently agreeing. He had never seen a group so determined, so willing to fight for something greater than themselves. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their freedom. For their future, Ethan turned to Lyra, his gaze steady. "What now?" Lyra's expression hardened as she looked ahead. "Now we prepare. We gather our forces, we strengthen our base, and we start pushing back. The hunters will come again, but this time, we'll be ready." Ethan nodded. He had seen the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had driven her to survive and lead her people to this moment. He knew she wasn't just talking about physical strength. She was talking about a strength of will. Ada was determined to see this through, no matter the cost. "You're not alone in this," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll be with you, every step of the way." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes softening. "I know, and I'm grateful for that." For the first time since they had met, Ethan saw a true smile on Lyra's face. It was small, but it was real. That moment he realized how much she had changed, not just because of the battle, but because she had learned to trust again. And in return, she had given him something he hadn't expected, a sense of purpose. The next few days were spent strengthening the base and preparing for the next phase of the Resistance's campaign. Ethan worked alongside the fighters, using his skills to help where he could. He had learned much in his time with Lyra about her people, their struggles, and their fight for survival. But more than that, he had learned what it meant to stand for something bigger than himself. As they worked, the bond between Ethan and Lyra grew stronger. They had faced death together, fought side by side, and now they were building a future together. A future that, for the first time, seemed possible. One evening, as they stood outside the base, watching the stars flicker overhead, Lyra turned to Ethan. "We've come so far," she said quietly. "I don't know if I could have done this." "Without you?" Ethan smiled, his heart light. "You didn't have to. You already had the strength. I just helped you get there." She looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Maybe, but it feels like we're starting something new. Something worth fighting for. I think I'm ready for it." Ethan nodded in return, the weight of their shared journey hanging in the air. "We both are." They stood together, side by side, looking at the future. It was uncertain, full of challenges and obstacles. But it was theirs to shape. As long as they had each other, they knew they could face whatever came next. The stars above them seemed to shine a little brighter that night, as if the universe itself was giving them a sign. The battle wasn't over, but they had won something far more important than a victory. They had won a chance at a new beginning.